The ice did not speak at first. It only watched. A flat, white expanse stretching toward a horizon that felt older than memory. Older even in the stones of ancient cities where men once believed the world ended. On that morning, the sea was a mirror of frost and pale emptiness, and the ship carved a thin wound across it, a dark, determined silhouette forcing itself into a realm that resisted all intrusion. They called her the Saint Varvara, a stout vessel built with iron-braced beams and the confidence of men who believed maps could tame mystery. Her hull smelled of tar, frozen pitch, and the stubbornness of an empire convinced it could carve a passage through a northern wilderness that answered only to cold. The figure who stood at her prow was Captain Mikhail Rostov, broad-shouldered, quiet, and carved with the lines of too many winters at sea. His eyes held both ambition and the exhaustion of a man who watched too many crews vanish into fog, ice, or bureaucratic oblivion. Yet he'd accepted this assignment, to chart a navigable corridor along the Siberian Arctic coast, because turning it down would mean surrendering to irrelevance. He believed he understood danger. That belief would soon be tested in ways no charts had prepared him for. Below deck, Lieutenant Pavel Sidorin inspected the heating pipes. He was younger, restless, and painfully diligent, a man who believed order could outthink chaos. He had memorized the ship's design from keel to masthead, convinced that preparation offered protection. The Arctic would teach him otherwise. Still, he moved with confidence, stepping around sailors coiling rope and brushing frost from their sleeves. Among those sailors was Luka Trenov, a quiet hunter from the Kola coast who had joined the expedition not for honor or payment, but for escape. The sea had taken his brother. The north had taken his father. Yet Luka kept returning to its cold edges, as though bound a void by a thread of unfinished grief. The others considered him superstitious, but they listened when he spoke, because Luka noticed things before anyone else did. And on that morning, Luka noticed how the wind died too suddenly, how the water surface became unnaturally still, how the ship's wake didn't ripple outward, but stiffened into thin, fragile sheets that clung to the vessel like forming scars. He said nothing. Some instincts were not meant to be shared too early. The crew worked in measured rhythm. Chains clinked. Sails billowed with a breath of pale daylight. The ship pressed northward, trailing a path through slushy ice that thickened with every passing hour. On the deck, the coal bit at exposed faces with tiny crystal teeth. The smell of frozen canvas and distant brine clung to the air like a warning. Rostov watched the horizon carefully. He had expected resistance, slow ice, shifting flows, the Arctic's usual temperament. But this felt different. Not hostile, not yet, more like a presence waking from a long sleep. He flipped open his journal and wrote a single line, the silence as weight. Around him, the world seemed to shrink. The sky was an immense gray plate with no seam, no mercy. The water grew dull, thickening from slate to silver to pearl. Even the sunlight felt reluctant, glancing off the rippling frost as if afraid to linger. The first real sound, the one that mattered, came just after noon. A low, resonant murmur trembled through the keel. It was subtle, like a whispered complaint from the deep. Some sailors ignored it. Others stiffened. Luka felt in the soles of his boots and stopped mid-step. Captain Rostov glanced down. He knew the language of a wooden hull under strain. This sound was not strain. It was a greeting, and not a friendly one. By evening, the ice had begun its slow, inevitable choreography. Small floes drifted toward the ship, nudging the hull with soft, deliberate taps. Sidorin ordered men to take soundings. The measurements were worse than expected. Shallow banks of forming pack ice, thicker than the charts had suggested, and earlier in the season than any report had predicted. The crew's laughter, once easy, became measured. Voices dropped. Movements grew sharper, as if the men feared waking something beneath their feet. Inside the officer's cabin, the map table glowed under a dim lantern. Rostov and Sidorin studied a coastline drawn more from imagination than experience. Their fingers hovered over potential passages, narrow straits between islands of ice, theoretical corridors that even seasoned navigators treated as rumor. Sidorin whispered, "If we push another 50 miles, the current should carry us eastward." Rostov answered only with silence. the kind of silence that holds doubt like a secret. Outside, the night thickened. Stars are behind a thin veil of frost. The temperature fell so sharply that the ship's ropes snapped faintly as they contracted. The men tried to pretend the world was still predictable. They sang low songs while working. They ate salted fish that had frozen solid on the plates. They wrapped their fingers in cloth to stop the skin from splitting under the cold's relentless bite. But nature had begun rearranging the battlefield. Just past midnight, Luca, taking a watch post near the bow, heard again, a crack, a slow, confident crack, spreading beneath the water like a dark thought. The ice around them shifted, drawing inward as if the ship were the center of an immense, invisible gravity. Luca leaned over the railing, breath turning instantly to mist. The moonlight caught something unnatural beneath the surface, a shadowless sheet, stretching wider than he could comprehend. He stepped back, his chest tightened not in fear, but in recognition. He whispered into the dark, "It begins." No one heard him. No one needed to. By dawn, the ship had slowed to a crawl. The sea had ceased to behave like water. Every ripple froze in place. Every gust of wind felt like a blade. The horizon pressed closer, drawing the world into a pale coffin of silence. Captain Rostov stood at the railing, eyes narrowing. He could sense the conflict forming, not between nations or men, but between human ambition and a world that accepted no trespass. He lifted his chin as if confronting an unseen adversary. The ship groaned beneath him, timbers flexing with strain. Then came the sound that ended all illusions of safety. A single, thunderous shudder rising through the deck. The first true crack, loud enough to silence every breath on board. The men froze. The Arctic did not. The section closes here, not with catastrophe, but with a chilling certainty that something vast had awakened beneath the ice, and that the St. Barbara, along with every soul aboard, had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The Arctic tightened its grip without haste, as though savoring the inevitable. Dawn arrived in fractured light, a pale glow that barely touched the deck before sinking back into gray silence that ruled these latitudes. The men rose stiffly, their breath spreading in faint clouds, their boots stuck to the frost-bitten planks, as if the ship itself tried to keep them from moving. The first sensation they felt was not fear, but heaviness. Heaviness in the air, in their limbs, in the growing stillness that surrounded them. The St. Barbara was no longer slicing through the sea. She was drifting, nudging, brushing, like a creature attempting to free itself from a web that thickened every hour. Captain Rostov felt that weight most keenly. He walked the deck with slow, deliberate steps, each footfall accompanied by the muted groan of imprisoned timber. His expression had hardened, not in arrogance but in resignation. The charts he had studied so carefully were proving useless. Lines meant to guide had become accusations. The ice was forming faster, thicker, with a self-assuredness that belied all predictions. Lieutenant Sidorin attempted to hold the crew to routine. He inspected the rigging, measured the ice thickness along the hull, and recorded temperature drops in his leather-bound log. His handwriting became sharper, more angular, as if the cold had begun shaping his thoughts. He lectured sailors on maintaining discipline, but even he felt the creeping dread that routine could not thaw. Order had its limits, and those limits were becoming painfully clear. The crew grew quieter. Jokes faltered, songs extinguished mid-verse. The wind, once a constant companion, disappeared entirely, leaving the men surrounded by an oppressive, breathless void. Even the ship's dogs, usually eager for movement, lay curled beneath blankets, eyes half open as if watching for something only animals could sense. Luka Trenov, the hunter, observed everything with a stillness that unsettled the others. He could smell the ship before he saw it. The metallic tang of deep cold, the faint sweetness of ice newly formed, the strange hollow scent of air that carried no warmth at all. He ran a gloved hand along the railing and felt the frost layering thicker, stratifying like bone growth. Each night he dreamed of cracking surfaces, of a great pale force rising beneath the waves. By the third day of captivity, the transformation was undeniable. The ship no longer moved. Ice had welded itself around the hull in solid sheets, gripping it like the fingers of an unseen hand. Snow fell without pattern, without mercy, collecting in ridges that blurred the boundary between sea and sky. The men stepped onto the deck and found the world reduced to three colors: white, gray, and the tar-black timbers of their trapped vessel. Rostov ordered the crew to carve channels through the ice, brief, desperate corridors in hopes of nudging the ship free. They hacked with axes and steel bars, sending shards of frozen seawater into the air. But each channel refroze minutes after being carved, sealing itself as if the Arctic were correcting an insult. "Keep working," Sidoran insisted, though his own voice lacked conviction. He knew labor for its own sake had become their only thread of sanity. Still, he watched the walls of ice thicken, and even his strategic mind began to falter beneath the monotonous cruelty of the North. Inside the lower deck, the world shrank further. Moisture from the men's breath gathered on the beams and froze into white filigree. Condensation crystallized on blankets. The oil in the lamps moved like syrup. Every sound, footsteps, whispers, the clink of metal, echoed with exaggerated clarity, as though the silence amplified everything except hope. Food became a concern sooner than expected. Barrels of hardtack and salted fish froze into near-solid blocks, requiring hammers to break apart. Water had to be melted from ice chipped off the rigging. Each task drained strength. Each breath felt borrowed. Conflict grew not between men, but within them. Doubt gnawed. Fatigue hollowed them. The idea of escape became less a hope and more a memory of hope. Rostov kept his fears hidden, but Sidoran saw the increasing stiffness in the captain's movement, the long pauses before he issued orders, pauses heavy with unspoken calculations. Luka, meanwhile, grew more certain of what was coming. One evening, as he stood on the deck, he watched a distant pressure ridge rise, an immense shard of ice lifting itself like a blade emerging from a sheath. It groaned with a voice that sent ripples through the frozen plain. Luka felt the vibration crawl up his spine. He whispered a quiet warning to no one in particular. "It is moving." The next morning, the world appeared unchanged, white, silent, indifferent. But beneath the ice, hidden forces were gathering. The men felt it in small ways. A sudden jolt that rattled the lantern hooks, a popping sound that traveled the length of the ship, the subtle tilt of the deck under their boots. Rostov held a meeting in the cramped officer's cabin. His words were measured but fraught. The ship would be crushed if the ice continued closing. Their only option was to lighten the load, redistribute supplies, and prepare for the possibility of abandoning the vessel entirely. Sidoran stared at the captain with disbelief. Abandoning an imperial ship meant admitting defeat, meant acknowledging that nature, not command, dictated survival. But he obeyed. The Arctic did not respect pride. The crew worked in grim silence, hauling crates onto the deck. Their breath rose in fragile plumes. The sounds of labor, thuds, grunts, the scrape of wood, echoed in the vast stillness like noises in a mausoleum. For every crate they moved, the ice shifted back, reclaiming ground. That afternoon, the true warning arrived. A deep rumble surged beneath the hull, as though the sea floor itself were turning in its sleep. The ship lurched violently to one side, throwing several men against a rail. A booming crack followed, louder than anything they'd yet heard, rolling across the ice like distant thunder. This time, everyone felt it, a shared realization, a shared fear. The ice was no longer imprisoning them. It was preparing to break them. As evening settled, a bruised twilight stretched across the horizon. The men looked out at the frozen plain and saw the faintest movement, long, sinuous ripples traveling beneath the surface like something alive. The Arctic had begun its siege in earnest. The section ends with Captain Rostov standing alone at the bow, his breath drifting in slow, ghostly clouds. He stared into frozen distance, knowing he was witnessing the opening move of a conflict humankind had never been meant to endure. Behind him, the ship moaned again, a long, shivering sound that felt like a warning and a promise. Winter had closed its hand, and it had no intention of letting go. Night fell without ceremony. No color, no softness, only a bruised sky pressing against a frozen plain, as if the heavens themselves leaned closer to witness what would unfold. On board the St. Varvara, every lantern burned low, their flames shivering in the draft that curled through the seams of the ship like cautious fingers. The ice did not wait for the men to gather courage. It began its assault before dawn, a deep, swollen groan rising from beneath the hull, resonating through every beam, plank, and joint. The sound was unmistakable. It was a voice of pressure, ancient and merciless. The ship trembled, not violently, but deliberately, the way an animal tenses before the bite lands. Captain Rostov rushed to the deck, boots slipping slightly on the powdery frost. He felt the vibration travel through the wood and into his bones. In that moment, he understood that the Arctic had shifted from threat to executioner. The horizon looked unchanged, but the ice below had begun to move, not outward, but inward, tightening around the hull like the closing ribs of a great pale beast. Lieutenant Sidorin arrived moments later, breath ragged. He clutched his notebook, as if numbers could soften the reality unfolding beneath his feet. But even he could not deny what he saw. The pressure ridges around the ship, once distant, jagged outlines, had crept closer in the night. Some now leaned toward the vessel, towering like frozen cathedrals, tilting under invisible weight. The men gathered silently along the railings. Their eyes were wide, their breath slow. No one dared speak. Speech felt sacrilegious, as though words might provoke the ice further. Luca watched them all from the far end of the deck, his expression grim, but unsurprised. He had seen seals crushed beneath shifting floes. He knew the sound of breaking worlds. Then came the first scream. It was not human. It was a ship. A single, sharp crack split the air, a fracture racing along the hull with such force that it seemed to slice the silence in half. Splinters shot outward. A sailor stumbled back, clutching his chest as though the sound itself had pierced him. Rostov gripped the rail, knuckles whitening. "This is the squeeze," he muttered, though no one heard the words. Below deck, the timbers writhed against each other, groaning, grinding, bending. The Arctic's pressure was not a sudden blow, but an unrelenting embrace, one that grew tighter by the minute. Sidorin sent teams to reinforce the beams, though he knew it would not be enough. Men hammered wooden braces into walls that shuddered under their touch. Others wedged iron supports beneath sagging planks. But each strike of the hammer only echoed the truth. The ship was preparing to lose its shape. Luca descended into the storage hold, where the sounds were darkest. There, he felt the ice's pulse. It reverberated up the keel, a deep, throbbing pressure like a heartbeat growing angrier. In the lantern light, he saw thin cracks creeping along the interior hull, delicate at first, then branching, multiplying, becoming veins of impending ruin. He touched the wood. It trembled like living flesh. Above, the deck lurched violently to one side. A wave of shouts erupted as men stumbled, grabbing rope and railings. The ice outside had shifted again, a massive slab rising, grinding, pressing the ship upward before slamming it back down onto another frozen plain. Snow billowed around them in ghostly clouds. Rostov barked orders, but even his voice had begun to fray. He knew the ship could not withstand such forces indefinitely. He knew that every groan, every crack, every tremor was a countdown. And yet, the story unfolding here was not one of panic. It was one of endurance, a grim, resigned endurance born from the knowledge that there was nowhere to run. The Arctic offered no refuge, only a long white emptiness waiting to swallow whatever broke. Hours passed with the slow agony of an animal in a trap. The ship listed slightly, then stabilized. The groaning eased. The ice paused its assault, not from mercy, but from calculation. The pressure shifting somewhere deep beneath the surface, preparing its next advance. The crew seized a moment to breathe. Some huddled around lanterns, warming numb fingers. Others stared toward the horizon, hoping for movement that never came. The dogs whimpered softly, noses buried under their paws. Sidorin approached the captain, face pale. "It is not finished," he said quietly. Rostov nodded. He looked older than he had days before, as though the weight of command had carved new furrows into his features. "The ice is waiting for a weakness," he said, "and the ship is running out of places to hide them." The young lieutenant swallowed hard. He had been trained for storms, for mutiny, for maritime disaster. But this was a siege by an enemy that could not be reasoned with or understood. an enemy without face or mercy. As evening descended, the temperature dropped further. The cold settled on the ship like a burial shroud. Frost grew along the lines of sails, turning them into stiff, crystalline sheets. The ropes froze where they hung, stiff as metal rods. Breath turned to crystals that fell like tiny stars onto the deck. Rostov ordered the crew to rest in shifts. But sleep offered no refuge. The ice continued its whispering. Soft cracks, distant rumbles, the near imperceptible groan of pressure shifting beneath the frozen surface. In the early hours before dawn, the next assault began. It started with a distant boom, a sound like a glacier being split by an unseen hand. Then the pressure surged toward the ship, rattling the hull in a wave of force. The men leaped from their bunks as the floor tilted sharply. Barrels rolled. Tools clattered. A second boom followed, closer, stronger. Then a third. The screams of torture would fill the air, rising and falling like the cries of something being broken apart slowly and deliberately. Splinters rained from the beams. The hull bulged inward near the bow, the wood bending like muscle strained past its limits. Luca shouted for the men to brace the section, but as they pressed planks and beams into place, the ice pushed harder, and then, abruptly, everything stilled. The pressure stopped. The groaning faded. Silence returned, thick and absolute. The men looked to Rostov. He did not speak. He only stared into the frost-dim light, his breath trembling in the air. The ship had not been crushed. Not yet, but the Arctic had shown its strength, a quiet demonstration of power that promised something far worse to come. Section 3 ends with the crew listening to the silence, knowing the next sound could be the one that ended them, and knowing, too, that the ice was patient enough to wait. The battle for truth did not begin with a shout, but with a silence, so taut it felt like the air itself might snap. In that hush, the island seemed to hold its breath. The gulls had vanished. Even the sea rolled quieter, as if aware that justice was finally approaching its shattered shores. And in that strange stillness, the loyal survivors gathered at the ridge overlooking the camp where Cornelis' dwindling men waited, pale, exhausted, yet dangerous in their desperation. Weeb Hayes felt every heartbeat like a warning drum against his ribs. Days earlier, he had been nothing but a soldier stranded on a barren rock. Now he stood as leader of the resistance, a role he never asked for but one carved out of necessity. The men around him, farmhands, deckhands, clerks, and one trembling adolescent boy, looked to him with the hollow-eyed faith of those who had seen too much darkness to trust their own judgment. Hayes didn't pretend to be fearless. Fear had kept him alive this long, but he knew something the others needed to believe. Cornelis could bleed. His reign could end. Below them, Cornelis paced in the sunlight, unable to mask the flicker of dread unveiling itself in his posture. He had once spoken with the smooth authority of a man who believed chaos obeyed him, but now the edges of his confidence had frayed. His followers, once intoxicated by his promises, watched him with growing suspicion. They had spilled blood for him, abandoned mercy for him, and now realized they might die for him as well. The crack in their loyalty widened when a rescue ship's white sails appeared on the horizon, glowing like a verdict in the late afternoon sun. Word of it swept across the island faster than wind. A ship meant authority, order, punishment, and suddenly the atrocities they committed were no longer buried in the dunes. They were exposed, undeniable, waiting to be judged. Cornelis saw it too. He froze, staring at the sails, as if staring could the ship back into the distance. Hayes knew this was their moment. Not later. Not at dusk. Now. We go, he said simply. No speech. No rallying cry. Just the truth. They descended the ridge in a tight line, each step deliberate. Sand shifted around their feet, like uneasy ghosts. As they neared the camp, the air thickened with a strange mixture of courage and dread. Hayes could see Cornelis whispering frantically to the last of his guards. Thin men who had once swaggered with stolen power, but now looked like frightened boys caught in a lie too large to hide. The first clash erupted when one mutineer, pushed by panic rather than loyalty, rushed forward with a crude spear. Hayes sidestepped the thrust and slammed the man into the ground, the impact sending a cloud of dust spiraling upward. The man didn't rise again. That single fall broke whatever remained of Cornwallis' illusion of superiority. His guards hesitated. Their weapons wavered. The group behind Hayes surged with newfound strength, emboldened by the sight of their enemy faltering. Cornwallis tried to bark commands, but his voice cracked. His men no longer heard him. Fear had reshaped their allegiance. The mutiny, once a roaring fire, collapsed into dying embers. And in that collapse, Cornwallis understood he was alone. Hayes strode directly toward him. Cornwallis backed away, step by step, as though each grain of sand beneath his feet betrayed him. His hands, once used to gesture grandly as he justified murder, trembled uncontrollably. "You don't understand," Cornwallis whispered. His bravado melted into a plea. "You think you're saving them. But without control, without—" "Enough," Hayes said, 2 syllables sharp as a blade. Cornwallis lunged, not with skill, not with strength, but with the frantic finality of a man cornered by his own sins. Hayes caught his wrist, twisted, and sent him sprawling into the sand. The others rushed in, binding his hands with rope fashioned from torn garments. Cornwallis thrashed, but he was finished. The man who had lorded over starving survivors now lay helpless beneath the open, judging sky. When the Loyalists dragged him upright, the remaining mutineers dropped their weapons without a word. The fight was over before it had truly begun. The cruelty that had terrorized the island for weeks dissolved under the weight of accountability. As the sun dipped lower, bathing the island in gold, Hayes stepped away from the prisoners and looked again toward the approaching ship. It glided closer, sails shimmering with the promise of relief and consequence. For the first time since the wreck, Hayes allowed himself to exhale, a long, shaky breath that emptied out the nightmares lodged in his chest. Yet even as hope stirred, a new unease crept into the air. The ship would bring order, yes, but also judgment. Many would speak, many would be believed, but whose voices would shape the final truth? The island had become a graveyard of choices, some made in fear, others in desperation, some in the name of survival. And those truths would now collide with the rigid laws of the world beyond the shoreline. Hayes watched the waters shimmer and felt the weight of what was coming next settle across his shoulders. The island war was over, but the reckoning of guilt, of innocence, and of the stories each survivor would tell was only beginning. And as the ship drew closer, its hull cutting to the last of the daylight, a single thought rose within him with quiet certainty. Whatever happened next would determine not just who lived, but how they would be remembered.